Hello, and welcome to Nerdverse Unshuffled, a geeky podcast where we introduce you to the language of board games. We are your hosts, Jacques van Heerden and Fayard Hendricks. So before we get stuck into today's topic, we got some listener feedback after our last episode on components, and that listener was me. So when it comes to components, I think it's important to note that overly expensive components and super deluxe Kickstarters are not the way to go when you're just starting out in the hobby. In fact, even experienced board gamers need to be reminded about this occasionally, because there is that temptation to always want to get the fanciest, newest, coolest, hottest, most exciting, most deluxe, most expensive version of everything. But it really isn't necessary.
I didn't come here to be judged in this way.
Well, some of us have 3D printers that we use to print or make our own deluxe components. So I wasn't going to mention any names specifically, Fayard, but Fayard. The thing is that even if you feel that you do have to just have the best quality components for your game, there are cheaper options. So, for example, like 3D printing, whatever. So there are options for upgrading that are cheaper than investing in official upgrades or backing the highest tier Kickstarter or importing things or, whatever. It's always just a good thing to tell yourself the game as I received it is fine.
Yes. And on top of that, you don't need to have every expansion for the game. And for the most part, they won't get played. Speaking from experience here.
Speaking from experience, in my case, I went overboard in terms of upgrading components for a game that I have since decided I'm not actually going to play again. So, and this isn't something that everybody else told me. No, you're never going to play this game again. I eventually just realized, you know what? I've played better games now, and I'm not so invested in this version of the game being as kitted out as I could possibly make it.
Yeah,
it was a very good idea, but it was a good idea 10 years ago, and I need to let it go.
I went in heavy on a game that I really, really enjoy, but the group doesn't. So while I have a fair number of expansions for it, I also recognize that quite likely the only person who's going to be playing it is myself in solo mode, which is all right.
There are a couple of games that come to mind when you say that. I'm not going to mention any of them because this listener's corner has been self-indulgent enough.
Yes. So if you have any feedback that you'd like to share with us for this or future podcasts, join the Nerdverse Discord where you can chat with us directly, ask questions, or suggest topics that you'd like us to cover in upcoming episodes. You can also email us at podcast@nerdverse.co.za, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Great. And now, as always, our little disclaimer. During the course of this episode, we may refer to jargon terms without explaining them. Do not fear. You can find definitions and discussions for any jargon terms that we do use in the episode by going to nerdverse.co.za and looking up the series of articles titled Board Game Jargon Primer.
Yeah, and like we mentioned, each jargon term will get its own podcast. So check us out. Keep an ear on or an eye out for future episodes. But for now, on with the show.
So in this episode, we give a very brief overview of 3 types of creators involved in making a board game and in getting it into our greedy hands. Designers, artists, and publishers. So let's hear it for the people who make this hobby what it is and look a little at how each of them contributes to making our beautiful and beloved board games. So as we do with every episode, let's start with the definition, or 3, from the Board Game Jargon Primer. Take it away, Fayard.
Thank you. So let's start with the board game designer. The designer is the person who fits all of the mechanics together into a themed board game that you purchase and play with your friends. They are akin to the author of a book or perhaps the director of a movie. and are acknowledged as the author for the purposes of copyright. I know you all know what an artist is, but board game art is its own separate thing, and the look of a game can literally make or break its sales run. Furthermore, there are incentives for artists to put clear, intuitive layouts and iconography into the game to enhance playability. And so gamers tend to follow artists almost as much as they do the designers themselves. And finally, a board game publisher is a large or small company, much like a book or video game publisher. And they handle the production and distribution of board games once the designer has finished creating a working, testing prototype, and once the artist has finished putting all the art together for it. Not all publishers handle distribution of the games, and they will hand these tasks over to larger publishers or distribution companies. And we'll talk about a lot of these later.
Just as a final thing, each of these terms is going to get its own episode, but each of these is such a broad topic, and there are so many designers and artists and publishers that we'd want to talk about.
Correct.
That we're going to be barely scratching the surface here. And these definitions are very truncated from what's in the actual full descriptions, but I think they serve as a useful sort of introduction to the three very separate but very important parts of what makes board games what they are when they get to your table.
Correct. Yeah, so it's an overview, literally an overview.
Yes, very, very, very high level. So let's get into discussing those three sort of different roles. Okay, so obviously name recognition is great if you're a game designer. The more people recognize your name, the more likely they are to buy a game that you've designed. The greater number of acclaimed board games you create, the better known you become. But how does recognizing a game designer's name help us as players and consumers?
Yeah, it does and it doesn't. So some designers become well known for certain types of games. So you look at Vital Lacerda, for example. He's really well known for these insanely complex, convoluted games that have literally dozens to goodness knows how many interlocking mechanisms. And amongst his accomplishments for games, you've got The Gallerist, you've got On Mars, which is quite probably one of the most complex games that I've ever played. So Matt Leacock, on the other hand, is well known for designing Pandemic, which then got developed into its own entire series of board games. And he followed that up with another popular game, Forbidden Island, which is its own series of games altogether. In fact, the new one is being released either this year or next year, Forbidden Jungle.
Well, when we're recording this podcast, at least.
Yeah, at the time of recording.
Time gets all timey-wimey, as they say, when you record podcasts ahead of time. But those are actually two good examples because, from a consumer point of view, because while I love Matt Leacock's games, I've historically bounced off the Lacerdas I've tried quite quickly and quite hard, but that was also at a different time during my sort of gaming experience. So I hadn't really dealt with anything of a similar complexity, I don't think.
Not yet, no.
And it was just one of those games that I tried a little bit too early.
In fact, you have. You've played things.
Have I?
Yeah, currently I think you've played things of similar complexity and enjoyed now, but that's recent.
Yes. Yeah. I think the most complex game that I've really not just enjoyed, but actively fallen in love with was Ark Nova.
Yeah.
And I know not everybody in our board gaming group likes it as much as I do. But I really enjoyed it, and I would never have thought that I would enjoy a game that difficult. But the reason I find those two names and recognizing those two names useful is that I know that I'm going to enjoy the kinds of games that Leacock is famous for.
Yeah, absolutely.
Specifically cooperative games, which is something we'll cover in a future episode on play modes.
Yeah.
But also, Lacerda is very, very famous and very well regarded for good reason
Yeah.
Like I'm quite sure that my experience with him is very much personal, but it's also maybe a bit of a warning that just because a designer is really famous, it doesn't mean that you're going to enjoy their games.
Correct. That is quite correct.
But let's look at a couple of extra examples.
Yeah, let's look at a couple more examples. You've got Rob Daviau, who's well known for inventing the legacy genre of board game. And interestingly, he used to work for Hasbro. He developed the first legacy game, Risk Legacy, while working for Hasbro. And together with Matt Leacock, they designed the very, very, very highly acclaimed Pandemic Legacy game, which at the time was the number one board game for quite a while before Gloomhaven took the spot and was then subsequently superseded by Brass. We've also got, and forgive me for butchering the pronunciation of the name, because I've never actually heard it said out loud. Vlaada Chvátil, he's known for being insanely diverse in his game. So in a similar way, like others are specialists, you got Matt Leacock, who's very good at the cooperative style games. Vlaada Chvátil is really, really all over the place. So you've got, one of the most highly acclaimed party games ever, Codenames, all the way to some of the most convoluted, insane games on the level of Vital Lacerda's Complexity. So you've got games such as Mage Knight and Through the Ages. And between and around all these other designers, you've got other heavy hitters in this design space. You've got, for example, Dr. Reinet Knizia, who has to date well over 700 games under his designing belt, all published.
Yeah.
And there is a full list available if you really want to see it, but note that you'll also probably not get to see or play many of them.
Yeah, I was watching a YouTube video about designers recently, and Knizia's name came up, and at that point they were saying the same exact thing about him, but that was, I think, about 9 years ago, and he's still going.
Absolutely.
Like he really is still going. But he's another interesting example from a consumer perspective because he's very prolific and he's famous for designing great games, and then some games that maybe are not quite so well received.
Yeah.
So in his case, the name may be well known, but it's not going to tell you much about what any specific game is going to play like, or whether you're going to enjoy it, or whether it's a critically well-regarded game or a game that's regarded as like worth playing.
Yeah.
So in that case, when he designs another game, knowing that much about him might actually help you decide whether or not to take a chance on it, or whether you want to wait and see what people say about this specific game.
With Dr. Knizia, it's possibly best to wait and see, because he's a lot like Vlaada Chvátil, and like their ludographies, they are really, really diverse. So you've got, for example, on the really complicated, interactive side of Dr. Knizia's gaming design repertoire, you've got Tigris and Euphrates. All the way on the other side, you've got a game like Llama,
which I really liked,
which is about the lightest thing that you can imagine.
Oh yeah.
I think maybe I just need to quickly define what the word ludography is. And the same way that you got a bibliography from an author, a ludography is literally just the list of games that a designer has created.
Isn't that interesting? That's a great word to have in your vocabulary, I must say.
Yes.
I was just going to say oeuvre, but that's like not completely right.
Either word is pretentious.
Pretentious? Moi?
Anyway.
Fortunately, I think it's also a very, very fortunate thing that game designers don't just design the same game over and over again. I mean, each of these designers has something that they are well known for, but I don't think anybody would say that every game that they do is exactly the same. Even if it's like a part of a series, there's usually some something that changes.
I mean, even like the Forbidden Island series, for example, there's I suppose the soul of the game that runs through the series, but they're all completely different games in their own right.
Yes, but I think, having said all of that, any board gamer eventually has a list of designers that they would be willing to take a chance on, or that they'd be excited about hearing, oh, this person's designed a new game, or there's a new thing coming in this person's sort of body of work.
So, I mean, I know that there's the case for Uwe Rosenberg and Stefan Felt's games. Whenever a new game by these two designers comes up, people are like, oh, yes, we want more of that. But even Rosenberg, his games are, they started off being these very heavy Euro-style games with a lot of strategic thinking involved in a very involved game.
Many moving parts.
And then he designs a game like Patchwork.
Yeah, which I really enjoyed.
That's a fantastic game, but it is so not like the others, And then speaking of a gamer, designer designing riffs off a game, you have various titles of Patchwork, but the annoying thing is that by and large they're all the same game, and it's just the artwork that's different, which is weird.
Although there is, we're coming to artists after the break, but there is another example of this that comes to mind, and I wonder if you know what I'm going to be mentioning. But actually, let's pause there for a break, and we'll be back right after this.
Hi, Fayad from Unshuffled. Thank you for downloading and listening to the show. We're a very new channel and we really appreciate your support. If you like what we do, please like and subscribe to hear about new episodes. If you'd like access to bonus features, reviews, discussions, affiliate links and more fun downloads, consider supporting us on Patreon or Ko-fi if you're financially able. Otherwise, you can always help us get the word out about the show by leaving us a positive review on your favorite podcast app. And now, back to what we were talking about. Wait, what were we talking about?
Okay, welcome back.
Welcome back.
Have you thought of an answer?
Is it Boop?
It wasn't, but Boop is a good choice. I was actually thinking of Modern Art.
Oh, right. Yes, that's quite right.
But the one that we played has very different art. And I wonder if I would have loved that game as much if I had played the original version. And I suspect not. I suspect that in that case, the artwork really made the difference for me. Just to give a description, so the original version of Modern Art has this very sort of loud, I don't know exactly what era of art is being represented, but it's quite modern. It's things like Liechtenstein and artists like that.
Yeah.
And the version that we were playing with has people like Van Gogh and Monet and all these, Klimt and all these people. And I loved it. I loved bidding on those paintings because I just had this fantasy in my head of like, oh, I'm building up this amazing gallery with all these amazing artists that I really, really love. And the original one is just like, I don't think I'd buy any of these, honestly. But that's because I'm a savage.
Oh my word! No, I'm looking at this, and the Matagot version is horrible.
That's actually something that I did want to raise before we get too far into talking about artists.
Yeah.
But art is very subjective.
Yes.
And everybody is going to have an opinion. And as fun as it is to berate game companies and particular games for rather dodgy art, there will probably be people who really enjoy it and think that that's just the greatest thing ever. Or would at least be able to talk about it in an intelligent way without necessarily, putting anyone else's art down. So, with that disclaimer out of the way, I did want to make the point that game designers get a lot of attention, but I think, to be honest, possibly they get too much credit sometimes.
Yeah.
Because board games don't consist purely of disembodied mechanics. When it comes to components, for example, artists have a lot of influence on how you actually get to interact with the game. Artists don't just do the cover art. They don't just do the box art. They're also involved in designing the iconography, the board, the look and feel of the components, what you'd call in a sort of a computer, you'd refer to the user interface. Correct, like the interface between the user and the thing that they're interacting with.
Yeah.
That's such a big part of the enjoyment of a game, is interacting with like the beautiful artwork or the beautifully designed cards. And, the iconography that either makes it really easy to play the game or makes it really hard, and you need like a separate piece of paper with like a cheat sheet and like several, 100 pages of manual to go through, like what each of these things mean and like what the composition is. And, it's like, it can get very complicated.
Yeah, it can. What you find as well is that some artists like to work repeatedly with particular designers. So they're almost like, I think they form, very firm friendships. If it's, a single artist, single designer, so you get these almost legendary matchups. So, for example, Ian O'Toole, who is possibly just as much a rock star in board game design as Vital Lacerda is board game art as Vital Lacerda is in design. The two of them often work together. So you'll see a lot of Vital's games, the artwork is by Ian O'Toole. I mean, that's not to say that Ian O'Toole, works exclusively with Vital Lacerda, but if it's a Lacerda game, you'd be putting good money down on betting that the artwork is by Ian O'Toole. You've got an artist like Kyle Ferrin, who did this beautiful, almost cartoony artwork for the surprisingly violent game of Root.
Yes.
And then another name that I'm most likely going to butcher, Mihailo Dmitrievsky, who's worked with designer Shem Phillips. So Shem Phillips's games it's almost like these trilogies. But all the artwork for Shem Phillips's games are done by Dmitrievsky. And it's iconic enough that, you either love it or hate it, just purely on that side alone. And I enjoy it. Other members of our game group feel very strongly in the other direction about the game. And then you also get, board game designers who are artists in their own right as well. So I think Ryan Larkut is a stellar example of one of these. He does all the artwork for his own games.
Okay.
The designer/artist combination is a rarity. Most designers tend not to do their own artwork. They get accredited artists to do the work for them.
It must be an amazing experience to find someone that you do have this rapport with, that you kind of work out this sort of working relationship, or if that's immediate, or if you have to work at it or whatever. But to be able to find like the artist that really sort of understands what you're going for with the theme or the design or the game or an idea or a concept, whatever it is, that must be an amazing feeling.
I mean, I think with board game artists, it's a skill set on its own. It's not just that any artist can do it, especially if you're helping the designer put together things like how the mechanics are physically laid out on the board or on the cards or on the components. Because how you read a game from left to right or top to bottom or however way, it affects how people are going to see and interact with the game.
Yes. And I mean, I've used this example before, and I'll probably keep using it a lot, but the Tiny Epic series of games is great. It's a great example of this. And we were talking about components in the last episode. And one of the things that kind of strikes you when you open up one of these boxes is just how well thought out each of the components is, with how if you've worked with designers before, artists, I'm talking about graphic designers and artists before, you can kind of look at that and kind of just like the amount of work that must have taken just kind of wafts over you. And it's like, I think one last thing just to mention about when we're talking about artists is that I know that there are games that I've definitely been drawn to because I like the artist's previous work.
So I mean, let's talk about publishers.
Okay, so one, I think, possibly final disclaimer. This is a lot of disclaimers in this episode. Geesh. But like much like what's happened in the video game world, there has been a lot of competition and consolidation in the board game market. But we won't be covering the politics of board game publication and manufacturing in this podcast series. Mostly because we're not experts in either making or selling board games. We may eventually, if we're lucky, get a few local designers in to come and do separate episodes about their games and the experience of designing them and getting them published and getting them out there.
You find that one of the largest publishers of board games in the world is the French company Asmodee. And they're almost like the board game world analog to EA for video games, or I suppose Disney for movies, or Random House for books. Asmodee has literally hundreds of smaller publishers that they've absorbed under the umbrella in years, and award-winning publishers as well. So you got Z-Man Games, for example, who published Pandemic, who published A Feast for Odin, published the Forbidden Island series. You've got Fantasy Flight Games, Mansions of Madness series, or you're going to find just about any Cthulhu-related game that you're going to find is sitting under Fantasy Flight and therefore also under Asmodee. Fantasy Flight also have the licenses for Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. You've got Plan B Games, which publish Azul, Century Spice Road, and so on. You've got Lookout Games, which does a lot of Uwe Rosenberg stuff, so Patchwork, Caverna, Le Havre. And Asmo also have underneath the umbrella Days of Wonder, which does Ticket to Ride. And that's just a small example and small spattering of how many studios they have underneath the umbrella. It's a massive company, absolutely huge.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to think of a publisher that isn't under Asmo's umbrella, frankly. But there are some, obviously. So other non-Asmodee publishers include Czech Games Edition, usually abbreviated to CGE. So they're known for Galaxy Trucker, Codenames, and other games designed by, here's my turn to mispronounce the name, Vlada Shavatil. And also, obviously, the other big name in the publishing corner is Hasbro, which is famous for Monopoly, Clue, and The Game of Life. Risk.
When we talk about designers, we could also be mentioning Richard Garfield, who designed, the very first collectible card game, Magic the Gathering.
There are so many designers we are not mentioning.
Yeah. I mean, Magic the Gathering has so many artists under its umbrella, it's not even funny. If they're not the people who started up the company, so like Jamie Stegmaier, who owns Stonemaier Games, or Jacob Gazelius, who owns Fricks Games, you'll find that designers tend to wander back and forth between publishers. So yeah, there'll be maybe the couple that they prefer to work with, but you'll find that they tend to be all over the place. I mean, Vlada Shvatil, for example, Czech Games Edition publishes a lot of his games, but Mage Knight, for example, is published by WizKids, not by CGE.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely designers who've started maybe in a very traditional publishing house like Hasbro, and then have very much made their own sort of career and eventually ended up doing their own thing entirely.
Rob Daviau is the classic example.
Yeah. I mean, Eric M. Lang. One of his first games was designing a Game of Thrones, the card game, for Hasbro. And now I'm very much looking forward to getting my hands on a copy of some of his games, because I really do enjoy them.
Because Hasbro has also absorbed a lot of smaller publishers into its umbrella in past years as well.
like you say, a lot of competition and consolidation.
Absolutely.
How you feel about that is up to you. Leave comments below. So I think that brings us to the section we always seem to have in our episodes, which is, how does this jargon help us?
So, I mean, knowing a game's pedigree in terms of its designers, for example, designers, artists, designers, artists, and publishers in the case of Leshido O'Toole and Igor Griffin, they can help you look out for game ideas, implementations that you would most likely enjoy. So Uwe Rosenberg, for example, absolutely beloved creator, these really strategic, heavy Euro-style games. And on the other side, if you want these difficult to grapple with, difficult to learn, but really rewarding games, you look at Vital Lacerda. But I mean, just saying that doesn't mean it's going to be a universal truism, because we mentioned, Uwe Rosenberg, who created a really complicated Feast for Odin game, which we mentioned in the worker placement episode, as having over 30 worker placement spots. He's also created, like we said, Patchwork, which is this really simple two-player game that is absolutely delightful to play.
So then a slightly tougher concept to explain in terms of helping you as a consumer is obviously artists. So specific artists often work with specific designers, so that's something you can look at. Some artists have very, very distinct styles. What I would say about Dennis Lohausen, for example, who did the art for A Feast for Odin and Hansa Teutonica and Ark Nova, is that something that I really appreciate about the design of the two games I've played, so Hansa Teutonica and Ark Nova, is specifically how the artwork makes it, or the design of the components and the design of the iconography and the board and the components, everything basically just makes it easy for me to play a game, even if it's really complicated.
Yeah.
If the components are well designed, it just makes it so much easier to remember what you're supposed to be doing at any point.
No, correct. Because remember we said before, the artist is quite often responsible for executing the designer's implementation, and quite often they have valuable input into how the game's mechanics are going to be implemented, especially if it's a artist-designer combo.
Yeah.
So you find that, like you said, a lot of designers have pen and paper implementations, very rough ideas that they present to the publisher. And the publisher, either goes with their own artists or take suggestions of ones. But it is the artist's responsibility to bring that game to life based on what the designer wants in terms of the interactions and implementations.
Yeah. So, I mean, something that I have now realized as a result of just looking at that list of games that this artist has worked on is that I will be much more likely to try a complicated game if I see that he has been involved in the artwork.
Yeah.
Because of that question of implementing the mechanics and executing this idea of what the game is supposed to feel like and play like.
Correct.
Because in both of those, I enjoyed both of those games a great deal and had very little trouble keeping up with what was happening.
Speaking of Ark Nova as one of your favorite games, it's important to remember that multiple artists worked on it, right? And without closely examining the components, you won't be quite sure which parts Dennis Lohausen had a part in and which the other artists had a part in.
So I think, it may help to remember from the components episode that the art never trumps a game's mechanics, but terrible art can make a great game worse.
Oh, yes.
So in your case, for example, colorblind, unfriendly game layout, for example, can make a game unplayable. So
yes.
if there isn't some non-color based way of distinguishing between two different components, that basically means
correct.
That if you're colorblind, this game is not for you.
In fact, for some of the games that I've got, where I've been able to, I've either upgraded out the components, the offending components.
I suppose the other thing is that even a game with very little going for it in terms of maybe mechanics or complexity or anything else, if it does have beautiful artwork, I mean that also can kind of make a game.
It makes it tolerable, I think, at the least.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of games that I would suggest are actually mostly carried by their art, but I think that's also something we can discuss in a later episode.
Let's talk about publishers, right? Knowing the jargon about knowing your publishers, and I think it's an even harder sell than knowing about your designers and your artists, because quite often you'll find that designers will work with very specific publishers, and we mentioned, for example, that Lacerda works almost exclusively with Eagle Gryphon Games. And you'll find that in the case of the designer who owns the publishing company, like Jamie Stagmeyer, for example, he's going to release all his games through his own publisher. Why would he go anywhere else?
Yes.
And then you got the agnostic designers, so like the famed Dr. Knizia, who's released games with dozens of publishers, from Amigo to Blue Orange to, who knows, Fantasy Flight, I think, did Tigris and Euphrates. So he's all over the place, for example.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's a logistic thing, because Vlaada Chvátil, for example, releases his games through CGE mostly because he's in the Czech Republic, and it doesn't always make sense for him to release his games elsewhere. But that said, when you look at the game like Mage Knight that he designed, it's released by WizKids because WizKids hold the license and the IP for it. So it would make even less sense for Chvátil to release Mage Knight through CGE, because that would then include licensing costs, which why would you pay if WizKids already are a publishing house?
Yeah. I mean, look, there are definitely publishers that have a reputation for particular foibles.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you will also eventually get to know, a couple of publishers who have a reputation, for example, for delivering really beautiful looking games that don't always necessarily have great mechanics, or where there's some issue with maybe the manuals aren't very well done, or they're confusing, or they've got a particular tick that they like doing, or they're very heavily invested in minis, and they will add minis to a game even if it doesn't need them. So I think some publishers are easier to do this kind of thing with than others. Like with artists and designers, just because you like one thing that somebody does doesn't mean you're going to like everything that they do.
Correct.
But it may help to kind of distinguish broad swaths of stuff that you can then sort of either include or exclude when you're looking for a new game.
Absolutely correct. So I've picked up a couple of Blue Orange games without knowing anything about the game itself, which is really, really bad. I mean, I should research what I do. But purely because I've enjoyed the kind of games that Blue Orange put out, and they're famous for King Domino, for example.
Yeah, I think that's the episode.
Yeah, I think that's about it for these three important aspects of board gaming. Know your designers, know your artists, know your publishers.
What are we talking about next episode, Brain?
We'll be listening to smooth jazz.
No, we won't. I know lots of things. I know we won't be listening to that. Thank you for listening. You can follow us on various platforms and join the conversation on Discord. Links in the episode description wherever you found this podcast. You can find articles and discussions about the terms used in this podcast over at nerdverse.co.za. You can also find articles on a host of other subjects, including tabletop role-playing games, interviews, events, and how-tos. Your hosts were Jacques van Heerden and Fjord Hendricks. Music editing and producer, Fjord Hendricks. Executive producer, Jacques van Heerden. Unshuffled is a Nerdverse Productions podcast.